Jacob pulled up the net, but instead of fish, there was a human body, hands bound with wire, concrete blocks tied to the feet. It was murder. But when he checked the dead man's pocket, a chill ran down his spine. There was a note with his own initials. That night, when he returned to his boat, he found another message. He didn't drown. But what happened next was even more terrifying. Jacob Finch had spent his entire life in this town, a tiny place, lost among the rocky shores of Maine. Here, everyone knew each other, but the ocean remained a mystery, even to the oldest residents. It was a reliable provider, a harsh judge, and an eternal enigma. For Jacob, the sea meant everything. His father, Frank Finch, had once been the best fisherman in the area, a man who could predict a storm long before it arrived and find fish where no one else could. Since childhood, Jacob had listened to his father's stories about respecting the water, reading its moods, and never staring at the horizon for too long. Some said the horizon could stare back. But times had changed. The fish were becoming scarcer, and Jacob had to venture farther from shore. Some blamed shifting currents. Others said outsider fishermen were taking too much. But Jacob felt something else, a creeping sensation like cold needles along his spine whenever the silence stretched too long. That morning, he set out earlier than usual. A heavy gray fog had settled over the water, muffling even the cries of the gulls. In the distance, waves lapped softly against the rocks, but all around him was an oppressive silence, the kind that comes before a storm. But Jacob knew this wasn't the weather. He shuddered involuntarily and checked his nets. Then he felt the jolt. The boat lurched, nearly throwing him off balance. "God damn it!" he muttered, gripping the side. The net had gone taut, as if something was pulling from below. Strange. No fish could create such resistance. A seal, maybe. Or something else. Jacob tightened his grip on the rope, his palms suddenly damp. His breath came heavy as he pulled. His back ached, his muscles burned, but the net gave way, inching out of the black water. And then he saw it. Something dark, massive, just barely visible through the tattered wisps of fog. It swayed within the net, like something that did not belong there. And as the top of the net emerged from the water, Jacob froze. A face, pale, swollen, eyes wide open in a frozen scream. His stomach plunged. He barely registered that he had stumbled back, slamming against the side of the boat. Nausea rose in his throat, but even that was weaker than the ice-cold dread sinking into his spine. Something human was tangled in his net. Jacob recoiled so sharply that his back slammed against the side of the boat. He wanted to scream, but his voice stuck in his throat, his breath breaking into short, ragged gasps. Water streamed heavily from the net, filling the silence with dull, dripping sounds, each drop echoing like the ticking of a clock in an empty room. There was a person tangled in the net. Dead. His skin was deathly pale, stretched tight over his cheekbones like parchment over a skull. His lips were blue and swollen, his mouth slightly open, as if frozen mid-scream. But the worst part, the truly horrifying part, was the eyes. Wide, bulging, pupils dilated and glassy from eternity spent beneath the water, the eyes of someone who had died in terror. But this was no accident. The dead man's arms had been wrenched behind his back, bound tightly with steel wire that bit deep into the flesh, leaving dark, mangled gashes. And his legs had been weighed down with concrete blocks. Large, heavy, their edges jagged and broken. The kind used in construction. But out here, in the middle of the ocean, they had only one purpose. Someone had tied him up and thrown him overboard so that he would never resurface. Jacob swallowed hard, his stomach twisting violently. This wasn't just a grim discovery. This was a warning. His eyes darted across the horizon, desperately searching for anything, Another boat, a lone gull, any sign of life. But the ocean was eerily still, smooth as glass, blurred by the thick gray fog. No movement, no sound, nothing. And yet, that only made the fear worse. He was alone. Or was he? Through the roar of his own breathing, he strained to hear anything. Water lapping gently against the hull, the dull clank of the engine's levers, the faint creak of wood. And deep in the back of his mind, a thought flickered to life like a match struck in the dark. If someone had killed this man, what was stopping them from watching him right now? His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He needed to call the Coast Guard, the police, someone. He couldn't stay out here. And then, he saw it. Something strange. Something sticking out of the dead man's breast pocket. A crumpled, waterlogged scrap of paper. Slowly, as if afraid the corpse might suddenly lurch forward and grab him, Jacob reached out and plucked the note free. Squinting, he tried to make out the salt-blurred writing. JF. 3 letters. His initials. The world around him collapsed into a single, deafening sound, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. That note was meant for him. Jacob clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. A storm of fear, anger, and an oppressive sense of dread churned inside him. This couldn't be a coincidence. Forcing himself to look at the body again, he studied the face, now waterlogged and ashen, like stone worn smooth by the tide. But the features were still recognizable. A high forehead, a narrow nose, a chin rough with stubble. He had seen this man before. But where? The port? A bar? With trembling hands, he rifled through the dead man's pockets. In one, his fingers closed around a crumpled piece of plastic, a driver's license. The name leaped out at him. John Ferguson. It hit him like a dull knife to the gut. It was familiar. He had heard it before. But when? Under what circumstances? Jacob pressed his lips together, trying to drag the memory from the depths of his mind, but it slipped away, elusive as a shadow beneath the waves. He needed to call the police. He knew that. Any sane person would have alerted the Coast Guard, turned the body over, explained everything. But something inside him resisted. An instinct, honed over a lifetime, whispered, "Not yet." He didn't trust the police, not after his father had disappeared 10 years ago. When Jacob returned to town, he had felt eyes on him. It wasn't paranoia. It was experience. He had grown up here. He knew when the streets were watching too closely, so he went to the only place that might have answers: the police archives. Ben Carter, an old friend, had worked there for over 20 years. They had known each other since childhood. Ben was the one who had comforted Jacob when his father never returned from sea. Jacob stepped inside, forcing himself to stay calm. "Hey, Ben, I need to check something in the archives. You still keep records of old maritime reports?" Ben raised an eyebrow. "Haven't seen you in the station for a while, Jake. What are you looking for?" "A client of mine asked about a missing boat." Jacob lied smoothly, casting out the bait like a line into deep water. "I just need to cross-check a few names." Ben nodded, twirling a pencil between his fingers as he ran a search through the database. A few minutes later, his expression changed. His brow furrowed, his eyes sharpened. "Jacob." He looked up. "Are you sure you don't know this guy?" Jacob stiffened. "What do you mean?" Ben hesitated. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "This man, John Ferguson. He was reported missing 10 years ago. They searched for him, but he was never found." Jacob's heartbeat stuttered. 10 years ago. The same year his father, Frank Finch, had gone to sea and never returned. Frank had been an experienced fisherman. There had been a storm that day, but not strong enough to take a boat down. People had speculated. Maybe he had fallen overboard. Maybe the engine had failed. His body was never recovered. And now, a decade later, Jacob had pulled a man from the water who had vanished at the exact same time, with initials matching his own. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. Someone knew the truth about his father. Someone had been watching him. And maybe he was next. Jacob didn't go to the bar right away. He spent hours at the pier, staring into the black water, listening to the waves roll against the wooden pilings like the whisper of the sea, his father's old love. But now, that whisper felt ominous. Someone knew what he had found. Someone had left him that body, that note, and that someone either wanted him to keep going or stop. The bar by the docks was a place where time had frozen. It always smelled of salt, spilled rum, and something else. A mix of old wood soaked in the sea and something darker, something unseen, like ghosts lurking in the corners. The old men sat at their usual tables, their weathered faces curled into familiar smirks as they sipped their beers in silence. Their eyes, dulled by decades spent at sea, still saw more than they ever said. Jacob stepped up to the bar, settled onto a tall stool, and gave the bartender a silent nod. "What the hell happened to you, Finch?" the man drawled, polishing a glass without much interest. "Just an unusual day." The bartender snorted and set a drink in front of him. Jacob knew that asking outright would get him nothing but excuses. But rumors moved through this place like ocean currents. All he had to do was wait. And soon he heard them. Two old men in the far corner muttering to each other, thinking he wasn't listening. "Told you, Frank got mixed up with the wrong people," one murmured. "They drowned him, didn't they? Like the others?" "Hell if I know. But they never found the body, did they? Maybe he didn't go into the water at all." "Shut up, old fool. You talk too much." Jacob's grip tightened around his glass, but he didn't turn around. So the rumors were true. His father hadn't just disappeared. He'd been erased. He didn't remember how he made it back to his boat. His thoughts tangled, burning like cigarette embers in the dark. Who were these people? Why had his father ever gotten involved with them? Jacob gripped the boat's railing, preparing to climb aboard. And then he saw it. Something pale against the damp gray wood. A scrap of paper pinned to the side with a rusted metal tack. A note. His stomach clenched like a fist of ice. Slowly he reached out, tore it free, unfolded it. 3 words. "He didn't drown." A chill crawled up his spine, raising the hairs on his neck. Jacob turned sharply, scanning the pier. Empty. No one in sight. But someone had been here. Someone knew he was searching. Someone was watching. He bit down on the inside of his cheek and looked back at the note. Those 3 words carried more than just information. They were a challenge. His father hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered, just like John Ferguson, and just like they could do to him. Now he had a choice. Turn his back on the past, or dig until he found the truth. But one thing was certain. Whoever had left that note knew he wouldn't stop. And if he kept going, next time the body tangled in the net would be his own.